Let's talk about what actually happened when a gladiator lost. Because the reality is stranger, more complicated, and honestly more interesting than anything Hollywood gave you. First, let's get one thing out of the way immediately. Most gladiatorial fights did not end in death. This surprises people every time. We have actual archaeological and written evidence suggesting that somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 10 arena bouts ended with a fatality. The rest ended with one fighter down, unable to continue, and the crowd making a decision. And that decision wasn't the emperor's to make. Not usually, not in the way the movies show it. The defeated fighter, assuming he was still conscious, still capable of signaling, would drop his weapon, raise a finger, sometimes grab his opponent's leg. This was the formal request for mercy. The Latin term was missio, and then the crowd would respond. 50,000 people screaming either for his life or his death, and the editor, the person actually running the games, which was sometimes the emperor but often a wealthy magistrate or sponsor, would weigh the mood of the crowd and make the call. So, in a very literal sense, the Roman crowd had a vote. They were participants, not just spectators, and this mattered enormously to how gladiatorial culture functioned. So what actually determined whether the crowd called for death or mercy? This is where it gets interesting, because it wasn't just about who won the fight, it was about how the losing fighter had performed. A gladiator who had fought well, who had shown skill and courage, and hadn't broken under pressure, he had a real shot at walking out of there. A gladiator who had cowered, who had run, who had tried to avoid the fight rather than engage it honestly. The crowd had no patience for that. They'd watched him for potentially an hour or more. They'd formed an opinion. There are accounts of crowds demanding the death of a winning gladiator because they thought his opponent had actually fought better. The outcome of the fight wasn't the only metric. The quality of the performance was. Which tells you something important about what the Romans believed they were watching. It wasn't just a contest. It was a demonstration of virtue, Roman virtue specifically, which meant courage, endurance, the willingness to face death without flinching. A gladiator who embodied that, even in defeat, had given the crowd what it wanted. And crowds tended to reward that. But let's say the crowd calls for death. What then? The actual killing blow had its own ritual. The defeated fighter was expected to receive it properly, kneeling, helmet removed, neck exposed, not struggling, not begging. The sources are pretty consistent on this. Dying well was part of the job. A gladiator who screamed and fought against the finishing blow was considered to have disgraced himself in a way that the loss itself hadn't. Roman philosophers actually wrote about this. Seneca references the gladiatorial death as a model for how a man should face his end. Composed, deliberate, accepting. Now, here's where I want to pause, because if you haven't seen the video on what happened to gladiators after they won, you should really check it out. I also put a link to it at the end of this video. It covers the whole other side of this story, the prize money, the celebrity, the genuinely bizarre social status of a successful fighter. It'll give you the full picture. Okay, back to losing. The winner would deliver the blow, usually to the back of the neck or the throat. And then, as we covered in a previous video, the arena workers came out, the sand got raked, and the show went on. Now here's a part that rarely gets discussed. What happened to the body? If the dead gladiator had a lanista, a trainer and owner, that person typically had the right to claim the body. And gladiators, counterintuitively, were usually given proper burial. We've found gladiator cemeteries. One excavated in Ephesus had dozens of fighters buried with care, some with grave markers, some with evidence of elaborate funeral rites. These weren't men thrown in a pit somewhere. They were, in a strange way, respected. The Romans had a complicated relationship with gladiators socially. They were considered infames, a legal category of social dishonor that also included actors and prostitutes. Technically, a gladiator was beneath the dignity of a respectable Roman citizen, and yet they were also celebrities. Their faces were on lamps and pottery and mosaics. Women, including reportedly some very high-status women, were obsessed with them. There's graffiti in Pompeii calling specific gladiators the heartthrob of their neighborhoods. So you had this situation where the same man could be legally disgraced and culturally worshipped at the same time, and that tension followed him all the way to his death and burial. Now, what about the fighters who survived a loss? Because this is actually the more common outcome, and it's the one that gets the least attention. A gladiator who was granted missio, who was spared by the crowd, walked out of the arena that day, and then he went back to the ludus, the gladiatorial school. He trained, he healed, he waited for his next bout. That's it. There was no retirement after a single mercy. You went back in. The average gladiatorial career, based on what we can piece together from inscriptions and records, involved somewhere between 10 and 15 fights total, spread across years, sometimes a decade or more. A fighter might bruise 2 or 3 times over that career and survive each time if the crowd was with him. A fighter might win his first 8 fights and then get killed in his 9th. There was no predictable arc. That's probably what made it so compelling to watch and so genuinely terrifying to live. Some fighters did eventually earn their freedom. The rudis, a wooden sword, was the symbol of a gladiator's discharge. When you received the rudis, you were done, free. And here's the part that genuinely baffles most people when they first hear it. Some gladiators who received the rudis voluntarily went back. They signed new contracts. They returned to the arena. Why? Partly money. A successful gladiator could earn significant prize purses, and a freed gladiator with a reputation could negotiate very favorable terms. Partly, probably because the arena was the only life they knew. And partly, and I think this one is undersold, because the arena was one of the only places in Roman society where a man of low social standing could earn genuine public adoration. Slaves, prisoners of war, condemned criminals, these were the people who filled the gladiatorial schools. And inside that arena, for the duration of a fight, 50,000 people knew their name. That's not nothing. That's actually a lot. So when we talk about what happened to gladiators after they lost, the honest answer is it depended. It depended on how they'd fought, how the crowd felt that day, whether the editor was in a generous mood, whether their lanista had enough political pull to matter. The outcome was genuinely uncertain in a way that very few things in Roman life were. And I think that uncertainty, more than the violence, more than the spectacle, is what kept people coming back. Not knowing. Watching a man on the ground, waiting to find out whether he was going to walk out or get carried out. Feeling like your voice, your thumb, your noise in that crowd actually mattered to what happened next. Rome gave its citizens very little real political power by the later empire, but it gave them this, the ability to decide, at least once in a while, whether a man lived or died. That's a pretty significant thing to hand to a crowd, and Rome handed it out 100 days at a time.